Right now, sitting in your bank account, there's $450 that isn't there anymore, and you probably never even realized exactly why. Not because you spent it on something fun, not because of some subscription you forgot to cancel. A war on the other side of the planet reached directly into your wallet, month after month, and pulled that money straight out, and it's still happening today. If you've filled up your car recently, or noticed your grocery bill creeping up again, or seen your credit card balance somehow growing, even though you haven't really changed how you spend, this video is going to explain exactly where that money actually went. Let's start with the number everyone's actually talking about, because it comes straight from one of the most respected economists in the country. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, calculated that the average American household has effectively paid nearly $450 more on gas and energy costs directly because of this war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And here's the detail that should genuinely frustrate you if you're the kind of person who pays attention to your own finances. That $450 hit actually wiped out something you were supposed to be gaining this year. Trump's own tax legislation, what the administration called its big, beautiful bill, was expected to put an extra $384 back into the average household's pocket through bigger tax returns. This war didn't just cost you money on its own. It quietly erased a tax benefit you were told you'd actually be getting this year, and then took even more on top of that. So how did a war against Iran end up reaching directly into your grocery budget and your gas tank? Let's walk through exactly how this happened, because once you see the mechanism, you'll understand why this specific war hit Americans financially in a way that felt so immediate and so personal. Compared to other conflicts, most people just watch unfold on the news without ever feeling it in their own daily life. This war started on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes against Iran. Iran responded almost immediately by effectively shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply normally passes through every single day. When that much oil supply gets pulled off the global market all at once, prices don't creep up slowly. They spike hard and fast, and that spike travels directly from the global oil market straight to the gas pump outside your local grocery store within days, sometimes within hours. The numbers here are honestly staggering once you actually lay them out. Brent crude, the international benchmark price for oil, was trading around $73 a barrel right before this war started. Within about 8 weeks, it had climbed to $105 a barrel, a 44% jump. At the national level, gas prices crossed $4 a gallon by late April, and by mid-May, prices had peaked at $4.56 a gallon nationally, according to Zandi's own analysis. In some states, the pain was dramatically worse than the national average. California hit $5.83 a gallon. And according to research from the Center for American Progress, the states that actually saw the steepest percentage increases weren't even the usual high-cost states you'd expect. Utah saw gas prices jump 51.7% since the war began. Idaho jumped 45.7%. Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky all saw increases above 45% as well. So this wasn't just a coastal blue state problem or a red state problem or any kind of politically convenient story. Every single region of this country got hit, and in some of the most surprising places, it actually got hit the hardest. Groceries told their own part of this same story too, even beyond the direct gas and airfare numbers Zandi specifically calculated. Higher diesel costs, driven by that same crude oil spike, meant it became more expensive to actually transport products from farms, factories, and seaports all the way to your local grocery store shelves. That's an easy detail to miss if you're only thinking about this war in terms of what you pay directly at the gas pump. But nearly everything you buy at a grocery store traveled there on a truck at some point, and every one of those trucks was suddenly paying considerably more to fill up its own tank. That added transportation cost doesn't just disappear into thin air. It gets built directly into the price tag on your produce, your dairy, your packaged goods, quietly stacking on top of whatever grocery inflation was already happening before this war ever started. Now, that gas pump number is really just the most visible, most obvious part of a much bigger financial story. And this is where Zandi's full breakdown becomes genuinely important to understand, because it shows just how many different directions this war's costs actually reached into your household budget at once. Gasoline itself accounted for roughly $300 of that overall hit, just from Americans paying more to fill up their tanks since the war began. But that's only one piece. Higher interest rates added an estimated $150 in extra costs on average. Here's why that happened, and it's honestly one of the more frustrating parts of this entire story if you think about it carefully. Back in January, before this war even started, many investors and economists actually expected the Federal Reserve to start cutting interest rates this year, which would have made things like car loans, credit cards, and mortgages a little bit cheaper for ordinary Americans. Instead, The surge of inflation caused directly by this war completely derailed those plans. The Fed couldn't responsibly cut rates while inflation was spiking because of an oil shock, and some forecasters even started penciling in the possibility of an actual rate hike later in the year instead. So, on top of paying more for gas, you also missed out on the interest rate relief you were reasonably expecting to get this year, which Zandy specifically described as a genuine missed opportunity for both consumers and businesses across the entire country. Then there's air travel, which took its own direct hit. Jet fuel costs surged right alongside crude oil, and airlines, predictably, passed a meaningful chunk of that increased cost directly onto travelers. Airline fares climbed more than 20% in April compared to the year before, according to federal inflation data. Zandy estimated that added roughly $100 in extra costs for the average household, and across the country as a whole, consumers gave up nearly $10 billion collectively because of rising jet fuel costs alone. And finally, there's a piece of this that's easy to overlook because it doesn't show up on any receipt you personally hold in your hand: taxpayer costs to actually fund the military operation itself. According to Zandy's analysis, the United States has been spending an additional $50 million every single day just to conduct this war against Iran. And he estimated that translates to roughly $250 in added costs for the average American household, once you account for how that spending ultimately gets funded through the broader tax and government spending system. Add all of those categories together: gasoline, interest rates, airfare, and direct taxpayer-funded war costs, and you get to a full picture that's considerably larger than that initial $450 figure alone. In fact, in a separate, more comprehensive analysis, Zandy actually put the total cost to the average American household closer to $1,000 once you account for every single one of these overlapping pressures working together at the same time. And here's the detail that should genuinely concern you if you were hoping this was all just a temporary blip that would fully reverse itself once the fighting eventually calmed down. According to Zandy's own assessment, given directly to CBS News, the damage has already been done, in his own words, in part because there's no going back on oil prices, at least not any time in the near future. Even after prices dipped back down below $4 a gallon at certain points, economists have consistently forecast that oil prices are likely to remain elevated above pre-war levels throughout the rest of this year, even accounting for an eventual resolution to the actual fighting. Lydia Boussour, a senior economist at EY-Parthenon, explained why that lingering effect happens the way it does, noting that full normalization takes real time, especially when it comes to fixing supply chains and rebuilding energy production capacity that got disrupted during the crisis. There's also a genuinely fascinating ongoing analysis being run by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, a nonpartisan research organization that's been tracking the specific war's fuel costs in real time using official government data from the Energy Information Administration and the Federal Highway Administration. As of mid-June, their running tally showed the average American household had paid an additional $397.45 in extra fuel costs alone since the war began, with a projection that if elevated prices simply held steady, that number would climb to $712.32 by the end of the summer. And here's a number that genuinely puts the entire situation in perspective. According to that same tracking, Americans as a whole, collectively, had paid over $53 billion more to the oil industry specifically because of this war, just through the higher fuel costs at the pump alone, not even counting airfare, interest rates, or taxpayer-funded military spending on top of that. That $53 billion figure connects directly to something the Senate's own Joint Economic Committee flagged. And it's honestly one of the more striking comparisons in this entire story. According to their analysis, American families had paid more than $25 billion extra for gas alone since this war began, and that specific number actually exceeded the total cost of the war itself, according to Pentagon figures available at that time. Read that comparison again because it's genuinely remarkable. Ordinary American families, just from paying more at the pump every single week, had collectively spent more money than the entire war operation itself had officially cost the government to run. That's not a minor side effect of foreign policy happening somewhere far away. That's an economic burden that, dollar for dollar, rivaled the war's own official price tag, except this specific burden landed directly on regular households instead of the federal budget. Now, it's worth being fair here and acknowledging that the White House has pushed back on the idea that this war caused lasting economic damage. A White House spokesperson told CBS News that President Trump had always been clear about what he called temporary disruptions stemming from the military operation, insisting the American economy remained on what he described as a solid trajectory, pointing to a strong March jobs report and cooling core inflation figures during that same window, along with declining prices for things like beef, dairy, eggs, and prescription drugs, which the administration credited to its broader economic policies. 68B. That's a genuinely important perspective to include here. because not every single economic indicator during this period was moving in a negative direction. And it's fair to note that a complicated multi-front economy doesn't move in a single direction all at once just because of one specific conflict. But even accounting for that pushback, the underlying inflation data itself is difficult to argue with because it comes from the government's own official statistics. The Consumer Price Index rose 0.6% in April, following a 0.9% increase in March, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, marking the biggest annual increase in almost 3 years, with prices up 3.8% year over year, the largest jump since May of 2023. And economists widely agreed on exactly what was driving that specific increase. Energy prices, including gasoline, which alone rose 5.4% in a single month. Scott Lincicome, a vice president at the Cato Institute, a nonpartisan think tank, put the broader outlook bluntly, projecting that a key inflation gauge could hit 4% by the end of the year, double the Federal Reserve's own 2% target rate. Consumers, he said, obviously want deflation, and he added flatly that Americans are definitely not getting that. There's also a quieter, more troubling story sitting underneath all of these headline inflation numbers, one that shows exactly how ordinary families have actually been coping with this financial squeeze in real time. According to data from the New York Federal Reserve, American credit card debt hit $1.25 trillion in the first quarter of this year, up almost 6% from the year before, nearing the all-time record set at the end of last year. At the same time, the personal savings rate fell to just 2.6% in April, one of the lowest readings recorded since the global financial crisis back in 2008, a dramatic collapse from the savings rates above 31% that Americans briefly reached back in 2020. Gregory Dacko, chief economist at EY-Parthenon, described exactly what that combination of rising debt and collapsing savings actually represents. Consumers, he explained, are increasingly facing what he called an income squeeze, forcing them to lean on savings, credit, and accumulated wealth just to sustain their normal spending patterns. In plain terms, that means people aren't earning enough more to comfortably absorb these higher costs. They're quietly draining their savings accounts and running up their credit cards instead, just to keep affording the exact same lifestyle they had before this war ever started. There's also a political dimension to how this specific cost has been discussed publicly that's worth understanding, because it shapes how seriously this issue has actually been treated inside Washington itself. The Senate's Joint Economic Committee, in a separate piece of tracking, specifically highlighted a moment where Trump was quoted describing his own reaction to rising prices in starkly different terms than most struggling families would likely use. A comment committee Democrats pointedly flagged alongside their own running tally of exactly how much extra American families had been forced to spend because of this exact war. Whatever your own read on that specific framing, it captures something real about this entire story, a genuine gap between how this economic burden has sometimes been discussed at the political level and how it's actually been experienced inside millions of individual household budgets across the country. Think about what that actually means for a real family trying to plan their own monthly budget during all of this. You're not just paying more at the pump on any single trip to the gas station. You're watching your credit card statement creep higher every single month, watching whatever emergency savings you manage. The war's own most direct trigger, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, has technically eased since those early, most intense weeks. But according to every economist cited throughout this entire story, that doesn't mean the financial damage simply reverses itself just as quickly as it appeared. Oil prices, once they spike this dramatically, tend to settle at a new, elevated baseline rather than snapping cleanly back down to exactly where they started. Supply chains take real time to rebuild. Energy production capacity takes real time to fully recover. And, in the meantime, that $450 hit, or depending on which specific analysis you're looking at, that closer to $1,000 hit, isn't some one-time charge that appears once on a single statement and then disappears. It's money that already left millions of household budgets, money that, for a lot of families, had to get replaced by credit card debt or drained savings accounts just to keep everyday life running normally. There's one more piece of this story worth sitting with before we wrap up, because it adds a genuinely frustrating layer to everything you've just heard. That extra money American families have been paying at the pump doesn't just disappear into some abstract global market. A meaningful share of it has flowed directly to oil-producing countries that had absolutely nothing to do with starting this war in the first place, including, as strange as it sounds, Russia, a country that's been under heavy Western sanctions for years, specifically because of its own invasion of Ukraine. Higher global oil prices lifted Russian export revenues right alongside everyone else's, meaning some of the exact same dollars squeezed out of American household budgets by this war ended up, indirectly, benefiting one of the very countries American foreign policy has spent years trying to economically isolate. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you personally noticed this exact financial squeeze in your own household budget over these past several months, whether at the gas pump, on your grocery bill, or in your monthly credit card statement? And do you think this specific cost, $450, or potentially closer to a full $1,000 per family, was something the country was ever given an honest, upfront explanation of before this war actually began? Let me know exactly where you land in the comments below, because I read every single one. And this is exactly the kind of story where hearing how this has actually hit real families in real specific ways genuinely matters. And if this breakdown helped you understand exactly where some of your own hard-earned money has actually been going these past several months, do me a favor and share it with someone else who's been feeling the same financial squeeze without necessarily understanding the full reason behind it. We're going to keep tracking exactly how these costs continue evolving in the months ahead, because based on everything the economists are telling us, this specific bill isn't fully paid off yet, not even close.